Welcome to the 21st Century Physio Podcast. We've got a really special episode for you here today. We've got one of the most well-known professionals in the movement space in the world with us, Professor Stuart McGill, joining us from the University of Waterloo. Now, most of you will know him from his many textbooks, his many publications, and his wealth of knowledge around the back and the spine that he's been doing for the last 30 years. So I'm looking forward today to a wealth of knowledge and hearing how I can go about developing and help you go about developing a career and achieve as much as this man has. So welcome very much to the podcast, Stuart.
Good evening, Stephen. And I have a sneaky suspicion it's the start of your day. If we were to drill a hole out in my backyard, I think we'd come out not that far from Perth, a little south of Perth out in the ocean. So we're almost in perfect 12-hour synchrony. But anyway, good evening, sir.
It is. We had a little bit of trouble working out the other times, but we got there on the end, which is usually the way with the other, working with people on the other side of the world. But, really honoured to have you here, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you out in Australia in a not too distant future, which we'll talk about a little bit later on the call. But I guess we touched on, you had a long, successful career over 30 years now. How did, what's the number one thing you've learned, through your career to date that's got you this far? Put the hard questions up front.
Yeah, that's obviously very difficult. It's like someone at the award show, who do you thank and what do you attribute it all to? And I really can't do it because it's a process. But I retired a couple of years ago, actually, from the university, and now I have a clinic at my home, and I see special people. These are people who really struggled with their backs. They've seen several clinicians and have failed to get better. So I see them 1 or 2 days a week. But going back to the beginning, when I was a young professor, I started with just one question, and it was, how does the back work? And my colleagues would say, why on earth did you choose the spine? Why couldn't you choose something simple like the knee? And I thought, well, the knee's not very simple to me because I don't see a knee outside of the whole body. But that's how it started. Just with that simple question. And of course, those questions expanded over the years as we developed more laboratory technology and whatnot. So we then began to investigate very specific pain and injury mechanisms as we developed the tissue lab and did more development in what we called the in vivo lab, which was the one we saw live people. And then an interesting thing happened about mid-career. Clinical groups, and realize I was trained as a scientist, not a clinician, and different clinical groups would invite me to neurology meetings or orthopedic meetings, and they'd say, come and tell us what you found out about how the spine works. And then they would say, well, that's an interesting perspective. We don't think that way. Would you come and see this challenging patient? This patient has really been struggling. And I said, well, no, I'm not a clinician. But they said, don't worry, we'll be there with you. Anyway, that was the start of my second career. And I realized that we do look at patients very different than the traditional medical model. And I became much more comfortable, and I will say skilled, at working with people. And then I started a research clinic at the university. When I started it, I set aside 2 hours for the spine assessment appointment. And my colleagues said, you're nuts. What are you going to do for 2 hours? Well, no one does that. And I couldn't see any other way because I knew that you had to read the person. And this is interesting when I read about myself on social media. I'm not a social media person, but I'll see some young person coming along and they think they know what we do, and they say, well, McGill is just this or just that, or some of my colleagues are just that or just that. And I know them pretty well, and they're so much more than that. And, we've done studies on psychosocial aspects that drive pain 25 years ago, and realized that this was all part of the picture. But nonetheless, we started seeing these initial patients for 2 hours and realized that 2 hours wasn't long enough. Within a year, we changed it to 3 hours long. And of course, the process started with quite a deep assessment, and we used all kinds of techniques to get the patient to tell us things that they'd never ever told to another clinician before in terms of the impediments to their success in the past. And once we understood what the impediments were, we, in many cases, didn't repeat them and got some success that way. But anyway, that's, in a nutshell, I suppose, the overview of the journey through to where we are now.
And so what did you see at the time was the big difference between the sort of medical view and, how that you guys were going about assessing and working with your patients or clients there?
Well, there were many. The first was we were motivated very differently. Clinicians generally are paid by insurance bodies and government groups to perform procedures. Well, we were never involved in that. We weren't interested in prescribing a physio technique or an osteo technique or an injection or performing a surgery. We were more interested in the assessment and wondering what was the mechanism causing this person's pain. In other words, we were paid entirely not to perform a procedure, but for efficacy. We didn't advertise. Never in our lives have we said, we're hanging out our shingle now as clinicians. No, people came to us because it became known that they, for the first time, would receive a very thorough investigation of their neurology, their anatomy, their mechanics, their psychology, etc., to arrive upon what this convoluted mechanism leading to their pain is. So that would be, I don't know anywhere in the medical system where that occurs. Clinicians don't get 3 hours to spend with a patient and for the first time really unravel. So I suppose the answer starts there.
Fantastic. So how does someone go about taking that assessment that you do in 3 hours and start to implement that into what they do in their day-to-day, with patients or clients? I know, here in Australia, it's still, unfortunately common that a lot of people do work off like a 20-minute or 30-minute, patient block.
Well, it requires a totally, it's a paradigm shift, really. We do teach an assessment course, and the beginning of it is, how on earth do you make this work? And I'm afraid if you are paid by an insurance or a government group for 20 minutes to perform a procedure, you will fail. And that's just the reality of it. We take as long as it takes to reach a precise understanding, and then we propose alternate explanations. What other explanations are there that are possible that can explain your pain? And we have to be able to rightfully dismiss those or knock them down. So we strengthen our hypothesis. Years ago, there was a great Australian physical therapist named Jeffrey Maitland. I don't know if you ever studied his approach or not, but you start with a history of the patient. And during the history taking, the clinician should be doing pattern recognition. There are very specific patterns for different types of disc bulges they might be dragging on specific nerve roots, for example. And the patient tells a story where already the clinician should be forming a hypothesis as to what that pain pathway is. Maybe there's several pain pathways. And then Maitland would then organize the assessment to test the hypotheses based on what he heard in the history taking and the patient's report of their pain patterns, what got it better, what got it worse, all these kinds of things. And then the assessment proceeds, but you see the assessment is a living process. What you would do for a 24-year-old male CrossFit athlete would be entirely different than a 65-year-old woman who's coming in and complaining and saying, walking now gives me back pain. It never used to. It used to relieve my back pain, but now that's shifted. So there's just an example. It's a very Maitland-like living process But clinicians need to charge for their time and their expertise to allow that model to work, not here's what I can squeeze in 20 minutes.
Fantastic. And I love what you said there, about really testing the person, rather than, I think a lot of the time, I think we're taught at university to go and test the test basically and start to, apply that. And that gives you this finding. But for me, it sounds like you're sort of stepping back and actually looking at that whole person as a whole and really coming into that biopsychosocial model.
Again, this is a huge myth, and it irks me a little bit when people say, "Oh, McGill works on a mechanical model," and I say, "Are you kidding me?" For the past 20 years, we've been I guess they haven't done their due diligence. I wish they'd get off Facebook.
Well, this will be going onto Facebook, so hopefully that will help educate them a little bit further.
Well. How many masters of the craft have you met on Facebook?
Yeah, not too many, unfortunately. So, look, I loved a little piece that you did a number of years ago now with Gray Cook, where you sort of went head to head there. What are some, and for those people who haven't, seen that series, I highly recommend you, go and watch that, because it's two sort of very different approaches, but it was a really intriguing series to sort of watch and, a lecture to watch. What did you take away from that interaction with Gray Cook?
Well, I don't know how much I took away from it. I certainly put a lot into the planning of it. And just to summarize that, Craig Liebenson, an American fellow, asked Gray and I, would we come to Stanford University and have a discussion or a debate or whatever you want to call it on how we would assess movement and arrive at some kind of understanding of a patient so that we could give them a recommendation to change their life, get them out of pain. Well, it was so interesting. This was a few years ago, but social media had really gotten going, and these disciples of Gray Cook and these disciples of McGill were about to murder one another. They said, this is going to be a bloodbath, and, but now I can answer your question. My objective was never to create a bloodbath, because as scientists and old-time clinicians, it was a great honor to talk to another colleague and listen to their perspectives. There was none of this name calling and denigration of a person. We would certainly hold each other's principles under scrutiny, but not the person. And Gray, we shared a lot of ideas in common, but we also have some fundamental disagreements, but that's okay. There are very certainly times and places. If you have a group of school kids and you want to get an understanding of their basic movement patterns, I suggest you start with the FMS. It's about the fastest way, most efficient way to do it. Is that going to take the kids to the Olympics and show them how to do it? Or is it going to give you an understanding of those who have pain, why they have pain, what you must do to get them out of pain? No, it isn't. So, it's context specific. So what I wanted people to get out of it, and one of the reasons I agreed to do it, was to teach the younger crowd how two scientists and clinicians debate a topic. It's very civil, it's respectful, but it's hard-nosed as well. If you don't agree, you have to say why, and etc. So it was really to give an example of how to debate. I hope you obtained that sense when you watched it, and I started out by saying the disciples of McGill and Cook were ready to murder one another. I enjoy Gray to no end. Whenever we meet, we have a beer or two together. We have fabulous discussions. He's a wonderful person. As so many people in the world. I mean, I can't think of anyone that I dislike as a person. And yet, if you listen to Facebook and these terrible debates and from people who, as I said, spend time on Facebook and don't get out to meet these people and really understand what their basic positions are, why, what skills they have to offer, and the context. It's also context specific. So that was why I did it. I hope that example came across.
Very much so.
Yeah.
I think, it was something that I took away. I was expecting UFC, 101 to occur. And, for me, it was, there was a lot of respect there. There's a lot of, shared mutual, points as you made, but some big fundamental differences there. But you both, not agreed to disagree, but, you both saw each other's view and, it was just a spectrum almost.
Exactly. It's a context and a spectrum, as it is with all, I know I get contrasted against many of the other current people now, but I know them all, and we all talk and quite enjoy it. But there are some people who profit, I think, from making great dissonance of it all.
Yeah. And so, like you mentioned a couple of times already that, there's a number of people who, probably say that you're not, you don't engage in the biopsychosocial and, it's all about the mechanics. Why do you think that people associate that with you? Because that's not what I've got from, my understanding of your work.
I really don't know. They, I think, are educated on Facebook.
Yep.
I think that's the bottom line. But it's also not to blame them exclusively. When you think about an instrument like Twitter that allows a person who hasn't earned a forum yet to give an opinion, but they get the forum. And they give an opinion and they put out a word-limited statement. But now you and I are talking back and forth. I'm listening to your questions. I'm trying to answer. You're going to react to them and answer back, and I'm going to listen to those. And you get what I mean. Well, you can't do that with Twitter when you have, I don't know how many words you get to basically tell something to someone. It's designed to create controversy and pigeonhole philosophies and people so that they become unidimensional. Gone are the days, it seems, where we would go to conferences and have round tables and then entertain questions from an audience where each of the people at on the stage, so to speak, would give a perspective, and there might be a second round of reactions. So it's a combination of things. I think. Yeah. And so the universities are supposed to be doing this, by the way.
Yeah.
But I think they're changing too, unfortunately.
Yeah. And so obviously these things aren't going to go away though. Is there ways that we can better potentially use these things? I guess you've seen this better than anyone through your career. As you just, politely told me before, when you first started, computers weren't even invented. So, how's this evolved through your career and where do you see this heading in the future and can we utilize these tools for good?
Well, what tools are you specifically talking about?
Especially social media in this case.
Yeah, I'm really not the guy to answer this because I'm quite horrified with how when we have a leader of one of the most powerful countries of the world and probably the leader, well, I won't say the second power, but certainly what's considered the great power, who now thinks it is okay to dismiss science. He thinks it's okay to not challenge a scientific argument of a person, but to attack them personally. It is astounding, and younger people think that this is now a way to behave. It's deplorable. The world is not going in the right direction at all on this, and it starts right there. So, you're asking me, this is a very, very complex thing, but I hope after this, the pendulum will swing back the other way to civility, kindness, thoughtfulness, science, decency, what just every good adjective you can come up with to combat this just awful denigrating state that we're in.
Yeah. And going from the science, I guess, so you've gone from the scientist point of view towards the clinician. What skills do you think you learnt through that early part of your career, which has made you a good clinician, later in your career?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because when I first trained, I was trained as a scientist, and we spent a lot of time. I think of some of my mentors in those days, my PhD mentor, Bob Norman, or there was a gait biomechanist who you may have heard of, named Dave Winter, who was very influential in the walking and gait and movement area. And I took an entire course with Dave Winter on how to read a scientific paper. And it was just a wonderful term to spend. We just read paper after paper with a small group of 10 graduate students, and how he would dissect each paper. And then at the end, what was this even? Now we got all this fancy statistical significance, but was the question even clinically significant? Or the opposite might happen. And then, we have journals that won't publish a new clinical technique or test unless the reliability is shown. But now, I don't like reliable tests. I don't care if a first-year student gets the same answer from a patient than a master clinician. What I care is specificity and depth of understanding. The master clinician will feel all kinds of things. I was with a patient on the weekend with a couple of younger clinicians, showing them as we bent the knee and put more tension into the femoral root, not only did that patient experience creepy crawly sensations up the right side of their what they perceived as quadratus lumborum, but the knee stiffness changed. You could feel that a mile away if you were a master clinician. And then we had the person look down, and the symptoms resolved. Why? Because there was a neural underhook of a disc bulge on that femoral root at L3. So, we reached a very, very precise diagnosis. But it took a lot of mastery of putting together the patterns and then testing them and challenging them and trying alternates to really hone it down. So there would be an example of a test that is highly specific, very revealing and in-depth, but it required a lot of skill to obtain. So it was a highly unreliable test. Well, now that won't get published in the medical literature. So I learned all that as a young scientist. Those were the skills, how to consume a scientific paper. But then as I became a clinician, it was interesting. I was taken under the wing of a fellow named Dick Earhart. And Dick Earhart, Tony DeLito were professors. And Julie Fritz, you might know that name from the clinical decision rules. They were all at the University of Pittsburgh, and they would invite me down every winter, and I would give them a lecture on the latest and greatest discoveries in spine function and mechanics and that kind of thing. But I would stay for a few days with Dick, and we would see patients together, and that was such an education. He was such a wonderful fellow, had a wonderful way with patients and that kind of thing. And then, getting together with fabulous clinicians like, everyone has heard of Robin McKenzie, but how many people have actually been there side by side with them? And, Bill Kirkcaldy-Willis, Harry Farfan, who wrote Mechanical Low Back Pain. Vladimir Yonda was another great, the Czech neurologist. Pete O'Sullivan years ago I would spend a bit of time with, and just get wonderful perspectives from those types. Shirley Sarman would be another one from the physical therapy world that I really enjoyed. But then I would be asked to see world-class athletes, because these are different beasts. They load their bodies with big magnitudes, enormous speeds, incredible endurances. How do they do it? So when you take someone like the world's strongest man, Bill Kazmaier, for the first 3 years, and really study what he does to build that kind of back, I mean, this was just fabulous. And being around people like Gray Cook, Clayton Skaggs is another fabulous clinician who, if you go to his center, you'll see world-class athletes one after another coming through there, and they're not coming through because he doesn't make a difference. It's all efficacy based. And then I would get into the combative sports, and I think of there, someone like John Chainberg, who was just building some of the most dangerous men and women in the world in the UFC and whatnot, and in your rugby, for example, New Zealand and Australian rugby. Olympian coaches and programs from around the world. So anyway, it all combined to a fabulous education. And I took a little bit from each of them, learning their skills, how they handled their injured players, etc. So I'm sorry for being a bit long-winded there, but you awakened my passion there.
I love it. I love hearing about the people and the passion you have for the industry, and that you can learn something from everyone. I think it's a big thing that people have forgotten, I think.
Yeah, I don't want to interrupt, Stephen, but I just thought of another example. I had a patient who had won the World Poker Stars in Las Vegas. And he came in with back pain, and I said, I'll tell you what I know about back pain, but you tell me how you read cards. How do you know what the person's cards are? And what he told me and taught, and we practiced in front of a mirror reading a person's face, but it's become so invaluable for seeing pain in a person's eyebrows. Or just as you feel, it might be you touch a spinous process and it's a little tender, you will feel a motor unit twitch. And some people say you can't find that. Well, I so disagree. It almost comes laughable to the point where you don't have to ask if they have pain anymore. You will feel it. And the great clinicians, I might add, have always been developing of that sixth sense that the great ones have.
Yeah. No,
and then someone on Facebook says,
that's not evidence-based.
Well, you can't figure out what causes back pain, or it's not evidence-based and whatnot. And I think, they just need to spend some time with some masters.
Yeah, fantastic. So if you had to name, your top three, clinicians that you've met around the world, putting you on the spot, you've named quite a lot there. Who would they be?
Yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. Because there's no such thing as the top three. There are people who have incredible gifts to offer, insights, knowledge, skills, just the power of focus and concentration, human skills, to pull out three and say those are the top three. That's not the way it works. What you do is you take a little bit from everybody. And just keep learning. And I might add, you get a criminal as one of your patients, and say, what do you see in that person's movement? How did you know they were the mark? And when you have these conversations, when the lion sits beside the water hole in Africa, picking out which zebra is going to be dinner, they're just watching them move. They know who's the alpha, who's the weak one, etc. And if a clinician can't see that, I suggest they go and find another profession.
Yeah, no, fantastic points. I think take little bits and pieces from everywhere you can, and I love looking outside the profession as well. And some of those other examples are fantastic at that. When did you first run your first education course, I guess?
How old are you?
Me, I am 33 as of last week.
All right. Well, it was on your birthday.
Fantastic. That's a little bit scary.
Yeah. So, I started actually 34 years ago
Yeah.
teaching courses for outside of the university on weekends and that kind of thing to interested people.
Fantastic. And so what can people expect when they come to one of your courses?
Well, that's interesting. The real global objective to it all is this. I would hope that people have the desire to be the one clinician that changes people's lives. We've all had patients who come in who are distraught, lost, psychologically disturbed because they're clueless. Clinicians have tried procedures on them without assessment, and occasionally they get better. Sometimes they don't, and sometimes they are made worse. The patient has now lost faith. So the objective of our courses is to, for the first 2 days, describe how the spine works, neurally, anatomically, mechanically, how the brain interacts with it all, etc. And some thoughts on clinical approaches that would address some of these foundational workings, shall we say. Then we get into assessment. And as I mentioned earlier, I am not interested in teaching simple, repeatable tests because they're not very sophisticated and you won't learn very much. I'm more interested in specific tests that will reveal to the clinician what specific load, what specific magnitude, direction, endurance, repetition, traction, bending, compression, shearing leads that person to say, that caused my pain. Oh, that didn't hurt. So now I just have some clues as to where to take them. I know what causes their pain to get worse. I know what they tolerate, so we can start building some biological adaptations. And these are neurological, pain desensitized adaptations, just as much as they are tissue load-bearing healing adaptations. And then the art of it comes in a little bit. I know there are people on social media who now say, never tell a patient that they're fragile. Just tell them to keep working with their back. Well, wait a second. That might work for a patient who is a bit of a sloth. They are movement adverse. They're comorbid with diabetes. There's a reason for it. That is a pattern. But if you go and say that to a CrossFit athlete, who by definition is addicted to exercise, very proud of their body, carry on, you see the problem. Those are the ones that you have to say, no, wait a second. You have delaminated collagen fibers in your disc. And every time you do a set of 10 and break form with fatigue, you've just caused the nucleus to work through those delaminations. And that's why you get pain at the end of that session. And that's why it takes 3 or 4 days for it to balance up again. So, I don't understand how people can listen to these points of view, because every person is different. You have to treat that CrossFit athlete very different from the movement adverse, movement fearing person. To be the person that changes their life and takes them away from pain. So that's the second part of the course. Then the third part of the course is you've been successful, you've got this person out of pain. You've built a fundamental foundation for them to move and enjoy basic pain-free activity. Now you are the person who's going to teach them how to perform and adapt their body to do whatever it is. Maybe they want to run a marathon. Maybe they just want to play basketball or netball or cricket or something with their kids. Maybe they want to hike on the weekends with their wife. Maybe they want to surf. Maybe they want to go to the Olympics. So we then cover the science and the art and the experience of transforming those, because I don't know of another person in my area who has had more people go to the Olympics. Now, I know that's boasting a little bit, but I don't know anyone else who's. And what's so interesting is when I work for Olympic programs of countries around the world, it's the same experts they keep hiring. If I go to Spain or the UK or down to the US, they're hiring the same experts over and over. Not one of them are on Facebook as far as I've ever seen. But it's interesting. Why? How many car mechanics can build a car that will win an F1 race and then take another car and build it again to win an F1 race the next year? Well, there's probably 100,000 car mechanics or more in the world. I'll bet you there's 10 of them that can do that. Yeah. So it's the same. Anyway, that's the third part of the course. Know how to tune this machine from every perspective into optimality.
Fantastic.
And it ain't easy.
Definitely not. Well, if you'd like to learn more about some of these principles and how to improve your assessment and test that individual across the spectrum, how do they find out more about your courses, Stuart?
Yeah, well, there's two ways to do that. They can. I've tried to write a few different books. If I can just take 2 seconds to describe that. The first book I wrote for clinicians in 2000. So what's that? 19, 20 years. Well, it came out in 2002. So I guess it was around 20 years ago. But that I wrote for clinicians, and it's a hard read. I then wrote a book for savvy lay people and coaches, Ultimate Back Fitness and Performance. And I wrote Back Mechanic for the lay public because I was asked to. In a million years, I never thought I'd write for the lay public. And that was a tough book to read, to strike the balance between what was essential, but still keep it somewhat simple enough to be of utility for a person who was not medically trained. And I recently did one with a powerlifter named Brian Carroll, who came to me. He was a patient. He came to me with quite a horrific back injury. And we show his MRIs and the extensive tissue damage that he came to me with, which was the kiss of death for a powerlifter. And remember, he had a couple of world records. He'd already squatted over 1,100 pounds or over 500 kilo, or just about 500 kilo. And after 3 years, he came back and won the Arnold's twice once again. And you can see from his scans how his tissues adapted. Well, there aren't too many people who are really successful at adapting tissue to become that load bearing again. But anyway, it was a nice proof of principle with him. But so all of those books and the material, we have 3 courses that we put on: the foundational course, the assessment course, and the performance course. And when all 3 of them are together, we call it the summit. Well, we're putting on 2 summits in Australia. The first one is in Melbourne. Yeah, the first one is at Melbourne with a mutual friend of ours, I might add, at Ben Lustig's place in Melbourne, or Melbourne, as my daughter corrects me.
That's it. Fantastic facility Ben's got out there too.
Oh, yeah. Well, we had a course at Ben's place a couple of years ago, just a single course, and he's a fabulous host. And you're right. It is a fabulous facility. So that's in Melbourne in January 2020, coming up. And then we are in Sydney in the beginning of February, the following weekend, same 3 courses. So if people are interested in checking those out, if they go to backfitpro.com and then look under courses, they will see all the particulars there.
Fantastic. Well, I'll make sure all those links go to the books and to the courses, go in the podcast material as well. So we can do this all day. There's a wealth of knowledge there, and I'm sure we've only just scratched the surface of what has been a fantastic career. And I'm really looking forward myself to attending the course in Melbourne early next year. So Until then, I look forward to seeing you, Stuart. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us on the 21st Century Physio Podcast.
Stephen, it's been an honor. Thank you very much. We will have a VB when we get to Melbourne.
We'll definitely arrange that. Sounds like a good plan.
Attaboy, nothing complicated. We'll share a few thoughts and have a few laughs. You know, I have to tell you this. I honestly, I've never met an Australian I didn't like. What a lovely country and lovely people.
Oh, thank you very much. Beautiful. Thanks for joining us, Stuart.
My pleasure.
Have a good evening.